Hi everyone, welcome back to our coverage of content from Chapter 2, Traits, Behaviors, and Relationships. Last time we were introduced to some historical theories of leadership, and I mentioned that we would look into these a little bit more in depth as our semester progressed. Well, this week we will learn more specifics with these first three theories of leadership, the great man theories, trait theories, and behavior theories. Particularly, we're going to look at trait and behavior theories today. So our learning objectives for today's content are to outline some personal traits and characteristics that are associated with effective leaders and leadership, identify your own traits that you can transform into strengths and bring to a leadership role, to distinguish among various roles leaders play in organizations, including operations roles, collaborative roles, and advisory roles, and where your strengths might best fit. We're also going to recognize autocratic versus democratic leadership behavior and the impact of each, and know the distinction between people-oriented and task-oriented leadership behavior and when each should be used, and to understand how the theory of individualized leadership can be broadened or can help to broaden the understanding of relationships between leaders and followers. So the earliest leadership studies proposed that certain people had natural traits or innate abilities of power and influence that enabled them to put everything together and influence others in a way that other people could not. And so this was the great man approach, and it basically refers to a leadership perspective that sought to identify the inherited traits leaders possessed that distinguished them from people who were not leaders. So that was kind of the first approach, or the first ideas about how leadership was kind of developed, or how it was that strong leaders were created. The idea was that they had these inborn traits. But a lot more research has been done, and through that research, other models of leadership and leadership effectiveness have been developed. So some of that research that's been done on leadership has been categorized under the umbrella of traits and trait models of leadership, and that leadership has basically concluded that the main components to inherent leadership traits or characteristics include intelligence, initiative, interpersonal skills, self-confidence, and drive for responsibility and personal integrity. Ultimately, however, this research has shown that possessing these certain personal characteristics is no guarantee for successful leadership, however, and that traits may vary with the organizational situation. So in other words, just because a person has certain traits or characteristics, it still might be situational or environmentally dependent on whether they're effective or successful in leading. However, traits that may be central to leadership success have been identified, and they include such characteristics as optimism, self-confidence, honesty, integrity, and drive. So in looking at these a little bit more specifically, optimism has to do with the tendency to see the positive side of things and expect that things will turn out well. So being optimistic, being hopeful, those are strong traits of leaders, of successful, effective leaders. Nobody likes to work for a pessimist. Nobody likes to follow a pessimist, rather. So optimism usually is an attractive feature in leaders. as well as self-confidence, which is the assurance in one's own judgments, decision-making, ideas, and capabilities. So being confident in your own level of skills or aptness is also an important characteristic of being a successful leader. Honesty, which refers to being truthful and non-deceptive, it implies an openness for followers, or that followers are welcome. So being honest and transparent are important features of leaders as well. Integrity is also an important characteristic of leaders. And integrity means that a leader's character is whole, integrated, and grounded in solid ethical principles, and that he or she acts in keeping with those principles. So leaders who model their ethical convictions through their daily actions usually command admiration, respect, and loyalty from their followers. So they're usually very well respected, and their integrity offers them a highly reputable perception. Honesty and integrity are the foundation of trust between leaders and followers. So it's very important to the relationship. And drive has to do with having high motivation that creates a high effort level by a leader. So leaders with drive seek achievement, have energy and tenacity, and are often perceived as ambitious. So those are also highly reputable traits or characteristics of leaders. No one leader has a complete set of skills to handle any problem, challenge, or opportunity that comes along. This myth of the complete leader can cause more stress and frustration for leaders and followers, and can be very damaging to an organization, actually. So, as research has been furthered, it has shown that interdependence is really the key to effective leadership. The best leaders recognize and hone their strengths while trusting and collaborating with others to make up for their weak points. So in addition to the leadership characteristics that we've already kind of focused on, this slide shows what other characteristics of strong, successful, effective leaders has also been shown to arise in the leadership research realm. So they've got it kind of identified as personal characteristics, as well as intelligence and ability and personality, also characteristics related to their socializing skills or traits, work-related characteristics, and their social background. So these are all things that the research has shown to be important to leadership, but the 5 traits that we talked about previously with regard to honesty and integrity and drive and self-confidence and optimism are the key traits that have been found to be most important, along with this idea of interdependence and not feeling like you have to be good at everything and do it all by yourself. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on this particular slide, but I actually really liked this content from your book, The Leader's Bookshelf. It's the give and take approach to success, and it really made a lot of sense to me and seemed very simplistic. Basically, it talks about 3 different ways of being a leader, and which ones are kind of the best, which way is maybe the most effective or the best leadership style. One was, so it says here the 3 ways are you a giver, a taker, or a matcher, right? So givers focus on what others need and give selflessly. Takers put their own interests first, so it's more of a selfish kind of model, and matchers strive for a balance of giving and taking. So you can read through that and sort of see what you think you identify with the most, maybe for yourself, or how you have experienced other leaders in different jobs that you've had, or organizations or affiliations that you've been a part of, groups that you've been a part of, or whatever. And even for yourself, what do you think, how do you identify, which do you think you maybe more are? So have a look at this slide or read it in your book. I think it makes a lot of sense and really simplifies different types of leadership styles. Your strengths can really offset your weaknesses, but you must be aware of both, right? So the book places a lot of emphasis on utilizing your strengths and focusing on your strengths. In fact, your book says something to the effect that a strength arises from a natural talent that has been supported and reinforced with knowledge and skills. And talents can be thought of as innate traits and naturally recurring patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior. Once recognized, these talents can be turned into strengths by consciously developing and enhancing them with learning and practice. In fact, concentrating on your strengths and not your weaknesses allows you to excel in life by maximizing your strengths and not necessarily, dwelling on the weaknesses or trying to fix your weaknesses. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should ignore your weaknesses. You can always strive to improve in those areas and to find ways to compensate. So think about when you collaborate with others or you designate certain tasks to other people, maybe because they have a different skill set than you do with regard to a certain kind of task, delegating responsibility, complementing your strengths with other people's strengths, right? Kind of supplementing what you have to offer and what you're not as good at, having someone else supplement because they're good at that. And that all goes to that idea of interdependence, where even if you're considered to be the leader, sometimes you're not doing it all by yourself. You're reliant on other people to offset your weaknesses and strengths with their strengths. So kind of think of a puzzle. So you've got, pieces of the puzzle that other people bring to the picture that you're putting together, right, with their strengths. And then you have your strengths that you contribute. Everybody's got strengths to contribute, and they don't always overlap. Some things can be learned and built and improved upon with that awareness and with practice and experience. So leaders can learn to overcome some potentially limiting traits, such as a lack of self-confidence or a quick temper or something like that. So the main point is that you have these strengths and you want to play to the strengths that you have as a leader. But you're also going to have some challenges or some weaknesses or areas of improvement. You want to really, maximize your strengths and utilize those as best you can. And it's okay to work towards improving on your not so strong suits, but not relying on your ability to improve in those areas and starting to rely on other people to pick up where your strengths leave off. I hope that kind of makes sense. So last time in our content coverage, we made some distinctions between managerial and leadership roles and noted that both are essential in organizations and must be integrated effectively in order to lead to high performance and outcomes. So just as a reminder, we said that leadership cannot replace management, but management and leadership go hand in hand. So this slide shows one of the things that that comparison between management versus leadership. on the left-hand side. And so that's just a reminder for us. And then the right side talks about 3 different types of leadership roles. So it makes sense to consider these different functions when looking at optimal traits and characteristics of good leaders when matching strengths to various leadership roles. So recent research suggests that different leader strengths might be better suited to different types of leadership roles. So the diagram on the right of this slide illustrates 3 types of leadership roles: operational, collaborative, and advisory. And research also suggests that although there is a core set of competencies that all leaders need in order to be effective and successful, there is significant variation in the personal characteristics, behaviors, and skills that correlate with success in these different leadership roles. So when looking at the operational role, and kind of, so the operational role is basically a vertically oriented leadership role in which an executive or administrator has direct control over people and resources and the position power to accomplish results, right? So a vertical oriented leadership role really, if you kind of link it to the diagram on the left of this slide, you're going to be able to link those roles with more of the management side of things, right? So specifically management direction, alignment, relationships, and outcomes. If you look at what's included under management in those aspects, you will be able to directly align that with an operational role of leadership. In looking at the collaborative role, the collaborative leadership role, right, let me go back. Still talking about the operational role. Sorry, so this is really more like the traditional line and general management positions, the type of leadership role that someone might find themselves in, and utilizing those managerial traits. So the focus is on results. The leader is typically self-confident and assertive. They tend to be more analytical and knowledgeable and translate knowledge into vision. So those are some of the things that make the operational role more managerial and tied to those areas of direction, alignment, relationships, and outcomes that we talked about last time. Now, in comparison with the collaborative role, which is more of a horizontal leadership role, such as a team leader, in which the leader often works behind the scenes and uses their personal power to influence others and get things done, you're going to be able to align that more with the leadership side of things on the left-hand diagram, right? So when you look at the information under leadership on the left-hand side of the slide, you're going to be able to see that direction, alignment, and relationships really connect with this collaborative role, in that leaders are, including like project managers, matrix managers, team leaders, division heads, they have people skills that are used for networking and building relationships and tend to be very proactive and flexible. And so they really kind of seek out those different opportunities and rely on nurturing relationships in order to have optimal outcomes. Now, when you look at the advisory role of leadership, we're talking about a leadership role that provides advice or guidance and support to other people and departments in the organization. A little bit more of an oversight or guidance type of relationship, being responsible for developing broad organizational capabilities rather than accomplishing specific business results. So you have leaders, that might be focused on legalities or finance or human resources, and they really focus on people skills and the ability to influence others, and tend to hold honesty and integrity in high regard. So in thinking about those aspects of the advocacy role and trying to align it with the management versus leadership slide, what management versus leadership frameworks do you see in this leadership role? How would you link advisory roles with either management or leadership positions? So think about that on your own for a minute. All right, so as suggested previously, strengths are not just personal traits, but also patterns of behavior. So rather than looking at an individual's personal traits or characteristics, there's been a lot more research that's been done on leadership behavior that has been sought to uncover the behaviors that effective leaders engage in. Behaviors can be learned more readily than traits, because remember, traits might be kind of innate or something that you're kind of born with, some personal characteristics that you just kind of naturally have, or talents that are naturally there. But behaviors can be learned and developed, which enables leadership to be more accessible to anyone. So many researchers have examined the behavior of leaders to determine what behavioral features comprise leadership style and how particular behaviors relate to effective leadership. So we're going to look at an overview of the behavior approach and introduce the theory of individualized leadership as well, which looks at behaviors between a leader and each individual follower, differentiating one-on-one behavior from leader to group behavior. Okay, so one model of behavioral leadership approaches identified two main leadership styles. An autocratic leader is one who tends to centralize authority and derive power from position, control of rewards, and coercion. And a democratic leader who delegates authority to others, encourages participation, relies on subordinates' knowledge for completion of tasks, and depends on subordinate respect for influence. Research experiments have actually been conducted that have shown that groups with autocratic leaders perform highly so long as the leader was present to supervise them. So they tend to be a little bit more micromanagers under an autocratic behavioral model of leadership. However, group members were displeased with the close autocratic style of leadership, and feelings of hostility frequently arose. So yes, autocratic leadership can work as far as productivity goes, but it might not be the best style of leadership if you're looking at organizational culture, morale, and environmental aspects of a working environment. The performance of groups who were assigned to democratic leaders in these research experiments were almost as good when it came to, outcomes and productivity. But these groups were characterized by positive feelings rather than feelings of hostility. So democratic styles of leadership tend to create more positive work environments, have less toxicity in the work environment, and are still productive and have positive outcomes as far as whatever their goals are for the organization. The participative techniques and majority rule decision making used by the democratic leader trained and involved the group members so that they performed well with or without the leader present. So that's the other thing, that a democratic leadership style can be more, less hands-off and more empowering of workers, which leads to a happier worker, which leads to more productivity and output, and more independence in fulfilling their employment duties. Other research has shown that leadership behavior may actually exist more on a continuum that reflects different amounts of employee participation. So in other words, one leader might be autocratic or boss-centered in this model, and another might be more democratic or subordinate-centered in this model. And there could be a third or other kinds of leaders that are more of a mix of these two styles. So maybe it's not like one or the other, autocratic or boss-centered leadership versus democratic or subordinate-centered leadership, right? So this slide shows an illustration of what this behavior approach might look like, where leadership is on a continuum. Note, it could be that the extent to which leaders may be boss-centered or subordinate-centered depends on organizational circumstances, and that leaders might adjust their behaviors to fit those different circumstances. So it could be, external environmental circumstances like political or economic influences or factors, or it could be factors of your worker pool and what their skill levels are, or the dynamics between different positions or workers in the organization. So some of that could be dependent on the situation and not just the individual leader themselves. Other aggregated research on leadership behavior has identified leadership themes in this way: people-oriented leadership versus task-oriented leadership. So this slide shows you a diagram that exemplifies the consolidation of research in this way, right? So consideration, for example, describes the extent to which a leader cares about subordinates, respects their ideas and feelings, and establishes mutual trust, showing appreciation, listening carefully to problems, and seeking input from subordinates regarding important decisions are all examples of consideration behaviors. This really aligns with that employee-centered leadership where it displays a focus on the human needs of their subordinates. Leaders support and interact and have interactive facilitation. These are the two underlying dimensions of employee-centered behavior. This means that in addition to demonstrating support for their subordinates, employee-centered leaders facilitate positive interaction among followers and seek to minimize conflict. Okay, so that's your employee-centered or people-oriented behavior model, behavioral leadership model, versus the initiating structure, which describes the extent to which a leader is task-oriented. So in this model, that task-oriented behaviors are focused on initiating structures and where leaders direct subordinates' work activities toward goal achievement. This type of leadership behavior includes directing tasks, getting people to work hard, planning, providing explicit schedules for work activities, and ruling really with an iron fist. So it's very job-centered leadership that directs activities towards scheduling, accomplishing tasks, and achieving efficiency. So it's a goal emphasis and work facilitation. Goal emphasis and work facilitation. These are the dimensions that underlie this leadership behavior. So you've got the people-oriented or employee-focused behavioral models of leadership, and then you've got the task-oriented or initiating structure models of behavior, leadership behavior. Now, from those two ideologies or leadership styles that have been discussed in the research has been the development of other leadership behavior themes that stem from those, right? And one of them your textbook talks about is the leadership grid model, which is not shown on this slide, right? But you can refer back to it in your textbook. And the leadership grid basically describes major leadership styles based on measuring both concern for people, the employee-centered or people-oriented behaviors, and the concern for production or the task-oriented behaviors, especially measuring this on a gradient, right? So team management is one of the measures on the leadership grid, and that is when your leadership has high concern for both people and high concern for results. So where they're pretty equally people-oriented or employee concerned, or they're job-focused or task-oriented, outcome and result-based, like productivity-based, right? So people or productivity. And so team management is often considered the most effective leadership style and is what is usually recommended because organization members work together to accomplish tasks. Then there's the country club management gradient on the leadership grid, which is when the primary emphasis is given to people rather than to work outputs, right? So that means that yes, you're very much about people pleasing, but you're less interested in what your productivity is or the results of your efforts or being task oriented. So you don't care as much about the outputs as you do about taking care of your people. Then there's the authority compliance management, where there's high concern for your results or your outcomes or the goals that have been achieved, and very little concern for people. Not really taking care of your people, not supporting your people or employees or whatever, but really only caring about the bottom line, right? And then there's the middle of the road management within the leadership grid that talks about there being a moderate amount of concern for both people and production. So not a high degree on either quadrant of the gradient, but just kind of being in the middle of the road, mediocre. And then there's impoverished management, which is the absence of leadership, basically. So leaders exert very little effort toward interpersonal relationships or work accomplishments. So whatever happens, happens. There's not a lot of direction, and therefore there's not a lot of achievement, or goals aren't being met because there's not good leadership. So that is what is good about the information on this slide, is that it sort of consolidates all of the research on behavior models of leadership and talks about it, you know, as kind of the different themes that approach being related to people-oriented behaviors or caring about employees, employee-centered, versus being task-oriented or goal-oriented, and caring more about the end result of your efforts, and not as much about supporting your employees or subordinates. So with the other behavioral leadership models, you know, there's lots of research that's been done, and ultimately they have found similar things, just have used different words to describe those findings. Well, here's another research-based model of leadership that has been identified. So individualized leadership is a theory based on the notion that a leader develops a unique relationship with each subordinate or group member, which determines how the leaders behave toward the member and how the member responds to the leader. So in other words, depending on the relationship between the leader and the follower, each reciprocates a response individually, an individual reaction. So it's not going to be the same as any other member or subordinate or employee, right? So traditional trait theories of leadership and behavioral models of leadership assume that a leader adopts a general leadership style that's used with everyone, with all group members, right? And a more recent approach to leadership behavior, this individualized leadership, looks instead at the specific relationship between a leader and each individual follower. Individualized leadership is based on the notion that a leader develops a unique relationship with each group member, which determines how each relates to each other. And under this view, leadership is a series of dyads. So you have multiple people working in the same organization or the same environment, right? But the relationships are dyadical. And so a series of two-person interactions. And this dyadic view focuses on the concept of exchange, what each party gives to and receives from the other. So it's mutually beneficial. It's a give and take relationship. There's reciprocity in the relationship. And so this research has kind of been staged out into 3 phases. And the first phase is about awareness of the relationship between a leader and each individual. And that falls under the vertical dyad linkage model, which is a model of individualized leadership that argues for the importance of the dyad formed by a leader with each member of the group. And out of this vertical dyad linkage usually develops an in-group and an out-group, right? So you have a group of subordinates or a group of members that kind of click and are treated differently from the other group, right? So one is more of the in-group or the in-crowd, and then there's this out-group or kind of some group members who have been outcast for some reason or another, and they don't click as much with the leader or the relationships with the other members that are part of the in-group. Kind of related to that, from there, the second phase of individualized leadership is specific attributes of the exchange relationship, right? So this is referred to as the leader-member exchange. Individualized leadership model, according to this leader-member exchange, explores how leader-member relationships develop over time and how the quality of exchange relationships affects outcomes. So the quality of the leader-member exchange relationship is substantially higher for in-group members. Those tend to be the higher quality relationships that will lead to higher performance and greater job satisfaction, for in-group members, but it usually creates a toxic environment with poor working arrangements or experiences for members of the outgroup. And if you have that kind of an imbalance in your organization, you're usually going to find that it damages the productivity for the whole group or the whole organization when you have that dichotomy of relationships develop. There's also this third phase of individualized leadership, however, that is classified as partnership building, and this talks about whether leaders can develop positive relationships with all followers. So in this approach, the leader views each person independently and may treat each one in a different but positive way. That is, leaders strive to develop a positive relationship with each subordinate, but the positive relationship will look different or have a different form for each person, right? So you think about this, and you've probably experienced this, where you can have a good experience or a good relationship with your boss or a leader, and a coworker has a good relationship with them, but they're based on completely different experiences or premises, right? So they're not, it's not a cookie cutter relationship with every employee. It's very individualized based on the unique relationship between the leader and the follower or employee or group member, whatever word you want to use, to identify that subordinate. So lots of information about different research outcomes on leadership styles and types of leadership and leadership roles. I know it's kind of confusing in some ways because there's so much theory related to this stuff, but we want to at least lay out these different frameworks so that you have kind of an idea of how leadership has been thought of and described and identified through various kinds of evaluation, assessment, and research over the years, right? So just to recap, the point of this whole chapter and discussion is really to understand the importance of traits and behaviors in the development of leadership theory and research. Some traits associated with effective leadership include optimism, self-confidence, honesty, and drive. And a large number of personal traits and abilities have been associated with successful leaders, but traits themselves are not sufficient to guarantee effective leadership. And we also know that leadership behavior is also important to effective leadership, and behaviors can be learned, right? And some of the core behavioral models focus on leadership styles that are person-centered or employee-focused, or they're goal-centered or task-oriented focused. And some research suggests that maybe there's a mix of both of those, or maybe it's sort of on a scale or gradient or continuum, and is dependent on the environment or the organizational structure or organizational culture of the environment. And all of that combined might impact a leader's way of doing things, a way of doing business. So that's the main point for this week, and I hope that you can make sense of this, especially in relation to all of the self-insights that you will be doing for your own awareness of your own leadership styles or perceptions.